The words cut through the cigarette smoke and stale air of Motown Studio A like a blade-finding bone. It was November 1969, past midnight, and the building should have been empty. The hallways of 2648 West Grand Boulevard usually echoed with laughter and music during the day, but now they held only shadows. But David Ruffin couldn't sleep. The nightmares had been getting worse since his dismissal from the Temptations. Neither could Marvin Gaye, who found solace in these late-night vigils when expectations couldn't find him in the darkness. Both men found themselves in the place that had made them famous, and in Ruffin's case, utterly broken. "You know what your problem is, Marvin?" Ruffin's voice carried the particular bitterness of a man who had lost everything and needed someone else to carry the weight. "You sing pretty, real pretty, but you can't handle real soul." Marvin sat at the piano bench, his fingers resting motionless on the keys. He had been there for hours, not really playing, just sitting in the darkness of the studio, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. The session musicians had gone home. The producers had left. Even the cleaning crew had finished their work. But Marvin remained, as he often did, seeking something in the quiet that he could never find in the noise. Ruffin stood in the doorway, swaying slightly. The smell of alcohol and desperation followed him like a shadow, mixing with the lingering scent of expensive cologne, a reminder of better days. His once immaculate appearance had deteriorated in recent months. The silk shirt showed wrinkles and stains. His hair showed signs of neglect. But his eyes still burned with the fire that had made him a star, even as they reflected the pain of a man who had lost everything that mattered. He had been fired from the Temptations 6 months earlier, his ego and drug use finally becoming too much for even Berry Gordy to tolerate. The man who had once demanded and received top billing, who had insisted on being introduced as David Ruffin and the Temptations, now haunted the Hitsville building like a specter from Motown's glorious past. He would show up at odd hours, trying to convince anyone who would listen that he deserved another chance, that the group couldn't survive without his voice, that his dismissal had been a terrible mistake that needed correcting. "I've got pain in my voice, man," Ruffin continued, stepping into the studio uninvited. His footsteps echoed off the acoustic tiles, each one a deliberation invasion of Marvin's sanctuary. "Real pain. When I sing My Girl, people feel something breaking inside them. When you sing your love songs, they just feel nice." He paused, letting the word hang in the air like an insult. "Nice and safe and pretty, but safe ain't soul, Marvin." Ruffin moved closer, and Marvin could see the desperation more clearly now. This wasn't just drunken rambling. This was a man trying to rebuild his shattered self-worth by tearing down someone else's. "You know what Barry told me when he kicked me out?" Ruffin's voice cracked slightly. "He said I was difficult to work with, said I was unpredictable. But you know what he really meant? He meant I was too real for his assembly line, too dangerous for his safe little hits." His laugh was bitter, hollow. "But you're perfect for it, aren't you? Never cause trouble, never ask questions, just sing pretty and collect your checks." Marvin's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. Those who knew him well would have recognized the sign, the subtle shift in posture that indicated he was processing something painful, something that hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. But Ruffin was too lost in his own anguish to notice, too blinded by his need to make someone else carry the weight of his failure. The confrontation had been building for years, though neither man would have admitted it. David Ruffin had always been the vocal powerhouse of the Temptations, the one who could make grown women weep with a single note. His voice was an instrument of pure emotional devastation, capable of conveying heartbreak and longing with a rawness that felt almost violent. When he sang "Let On My Girl" or "Ain't Too Proud to Beg," audiences didn't just hear music, they experienced catharsis. Marvin Gaye, by contrast, had built his reputation on smoothness, on the ability to seduce and comfort rather than devastate. His voice was silk where Ruffin's was sandpaper, honey where Ruffin's was whiskey. The comparison had always existed in whispers, in the unspoken hierarchy of Motown's vocal aristocracy, but no one had ever been foolish enough to voice it directly, until now. "You want to know the difference between us?" Ruffin moved closer to the piano, his presence filling the small space with tension. I lived my songs. Every note comes from somewhere real. Your voice, it's just technique. Pretty technique, but technique all the same. Marvin finally looked up. In the dim light filtering through the control room window, his face was half in shadow, half illuminated. The expression was unreadable, but something shifted in his posture. A subtle straightening, as if he was preparing himself for something. But he didn't speak. Not yet. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Both men carried wounds that the music industry had inflicted, but they carried them differently. Ruffin wore his damage on the surface, in his increasingly erratic behavior, his demands for star treatment, his inability to function as part of a group. It had cost him everything: his place in the Temptations, his relationship with Motown, his sense of identity. Marvin's wounds ran deeper, hidden beneath the smooth exterior that had made him a star. The childhood beatings from his father, a Pentecostal minister who preached love while practicing cruelty. The constant pressure to be the perfect Motown artist, to embody Berry Gordy's vision of crossover success. The growing awareness that his political consciousness was at odds with his commercial image. The creeping sense that everything he had built was somehow false, a beautiful lie that would eventually crumble. Abraham, Martin, and John, Marvin said quietly, naming the Dion song that had been haunting him for weeks. You know it? Ruffin blinked, thrown off by the non sequitur. Yeah, so what? It's about assassination, about how the good die young while the corrupt live forever. Marvin's fingers finally moved to the keys, finding a simple melody in a minor key. Been thinking about recording it. That's not a Motown song, Ruffin scoffed. Too political. Too serious. Barry would never... Barry doesn't understand everything, Marvin interrupted, still playing softly. Sometimes the music chooses us, not the other way around. The melody drifted through the studio, sparse and haunting. Each note seemed to carry the weight of unspoken truths. Marvin began to sing, but not in the smooth commercial style that had made him famous. This was different, quieter, more vulnerable. His voice barely rose above a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire space. Abraham, Martin, and John, were you trying to say that a man can determine his own destiny? The words weren't just sung, they were breathed, exhaled like secrets held too long. Marvin's delivery was so intimate it felt like eavesdropping on a prayer. Each phrase was measured, deliberate, stripped of all artifice. This wasn't performance. This was confession. Ruffin opened his mouth to interrupt, to reassert his challenge, but something in Marvin's delivery stopped him cold. The hairs on his arms rose as if he were witnessing something sacred, something that shouldn't be interrupted. This wasn't the pretty voice he had been mocking moments earlier. This was something else entirely. Pain, yes, but pain that had been transformed, refined, distilled into something transcendent. Suffering that had been alchemized into art so pure it hurt to hear. Marvin continued singing, his eyes closed now, lost in the song. He wasn't performing anymore. He was confessing. Every note carried the weight of his struggles with his father, with Motown, with his own identity as a black artist in a world that wanted to package and sell his authenticity. The whispered delivery made each word feel intimate, as if he were sharing secrets that should never be spoken aloud. Were you trying to say that we soon would be free? The studio had become a church, and Marvin was both preacher and penitent. The simple piano accompaniment created space for every nuance of emotion, every crack in his voice, every pause that spoke louder than any scream. This was soul music stripped of all pretense, reduced to its essential elements: truth, vulnerability, and the desperate human need to be understood. Ruffin found himself unable to move, unable to speak. He had come here to prove his superiority, to assert his claim as Motown's most authentic voice. But what he was hearing defied comparison. This wasn't about who could sing louder or hit higher notes. This was about something deeper, something that couldn't be measured or competed with. When the song ended, the silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded it. It wasn't empty or hostile. It was full, pregnant with implications that neither man wanted to acknowledge. Marvin finally opened his eyes and looked at Ruffin. Still, he said nothing. The challenge hung in the air between them, but it no longer mattered. The response had been given, not in words but in music, not in confrontation but in revelation. Ruffin's mouth worked silently, as if he were trying to form words that wouldn't come. The bravado that had carried him into the studio was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like shame. He had expected a battle, had prepared for an argument about technique and authenticity, and who had the right to call themselves a true soul singer. Instead, he had been given a glimpse into the kind of artistry that transcended such petty distinctions. Marvin hadn't defended himself or attacked back. He had simply opened himself up completely, showing that real power lay not in volume or aggression, but in the courage to be vulnerable. Ruffin started, then stopped. What was there to say? That he had been wrong? That his own pain, real as it was, had blinded him to other forms of suffering? That Marvin's quiet strength was actually more devastating than his own vocal pyrotechnics? He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. At the threshold, he paused. That wasn't the Marvin Gaye everyone knows, he said without turning around. No, Marvin replied, his voice still soft. It wasn't. And with that, Ruffin left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Marvin alone with the piano and the lingering resonance of what had just transpired. But the encounter was far from over. It would echo through both men's lives in ways neither could have predicted. For Ruffin, that night marked the beginning of a different kind of descent. He had come to Motown looking for validation, for someone to blame for his failures. Instead, he had been confronted with the possibility that his whole conception of what made great music was incomplete. The realization was devastating. If technique and raw emotional power weren't enough, if there was something deeper, something he couldn't access through volume and intensity alone, then what did that say about everything he had built his identity on? The weeks that followed saw Ruffin's behavior become even more erratic. Friends who saw him during this period noted a new quality to his desperation, as if he were searching for something he couldn't name, couldn't quite grasp. He would show up at recording sessions uninvited, trying to recreate what he had heard that night in Studio A. But the harder he tried to find that elusive quality of vulnerability, the more it slipped away from him. Vulnerability, he was learning, couldn't be manufactured or performed. It had to be surrendered to. He began drinking more heavily, using the alcohol to numb the growing awareness of his own artistic limitations. The man who had once commanded stages with his presence now seemed diminished, haunted by the memory of a whispered song that had revealed depths he couldn't fathom. Studio musicians who worked with him during this period later recalled sessions where Ruffin would stop mid-song and ask, "Did you feel anything? Did that move you?" The desperate need for validation was heartbreaking to witness. The music industry doesn't reward uncertainty, and Ruffin's newfound self-doubt made him unemployable. Producers who might have given him a chance were put off by his inability to deliver the confident, commanding performances they expected. He became trapped in a cycle where his awareness of his limitations made them worse, which in turn deepened his awareness of them. For Marvin, the encounter served as both validation and burden. He had proven something to himself that night, had accessed a level of honesty in his music that he didn't know he possessed. But the knowledge came with a price. Once you discover you're capable of that kind of naked truth, it becomes impossible to settle for anything less. The months following that November night saw Marvin pushing against the boundaries of what Motown expected from him. He began work on what would become What's Going On, an album that would require him to access that same vulnerable, whispered intensity again and again. The smooth, romantic image that had made him a star started to feel like a prison, and he found himself increasingly unwilling to perform the role. The confrontation with Ruffin had shown him that his real power lay not in perfecting the Motown formula, but in breaking it, in finding the spaces between the notes where truth lived, in understanding that sometimes the most devastating thing you could do was lower your voice instead of raising it. Berry Gordy didn't understand the change at first. The Marvin Gaye who had recorded "I Heard It Through the Grapevine" and "How Sweet It Is" was a known quantity, a reliable hitmaker who could be counted on to deliver exactly what radio wanted. This new version, introspective, political, uncompromising, was a risk. But Marvin had learned something that night that he couldn't unlearn. Real artistic power didn't come from giving people what they expected. It came from showing them something they didn't know they needed to hear. The irony was lost on no one at Motown. David Ruffin, in trying to diminish Marvin, had actually liberated him. The challenge had forced Marvin to go deeper than he ever had before, to find a place in his voice where technique and emotion merged into something transcendent. Years later, when music historians look back at Marvin Gaye's career, they would identify 1969 as the turning point, the moment when he stopped being just another Motown crooner and became something unprecedented. Few of them knew about that midnight encounter in Studio A, about the confrontation that wasn't really a confrontation, about the challenge that was answered not with aggression, but with the most radical vulnerability. But those who were paying attention to Marvin's music could hear the difference. The change was subtle at first, appearing in the spaces between notes, in the way he held certain phrases, in the new weight behind familiar melodies. The smooth Prince of Soul was evolving, shedding his commercial skin to reveal something rawer, more honest, more dangerous. Industry insiders began to notice it during recording sessions. Producers who had worked with Marvin for years found themselves dealing with an artist who questioned everything. Song choices, arrangements, the very purpose of the music they were making. The compliant hitmaker was being replaced by someone who understood that his real power lay not in perfecting the Motown formula, but in transcending it entirely. David Ruffin never recovered from that night. He spent the remaining years of his life as a cautionary tale, a talented man undone by his inability to evolve, to find the humility necessary for true artistic growth. He would tell the story of that encounter to anyone who would listen, but always with resentment, never with understanding. To him, it remained an injustice rather than an education. He died in 1991, found in a crack house in Philadelphia, still searching for something he could never name. Those who knew about that night at Motown understood that part of him had died 22 years earlier, in a recording studio where he learned that his greatest strength, his voice, might not be enough. Marvin Gaye died in 1984, but not before changing the course of popular music forever. His whispered revolution, born in a moment of confrontation turned confession, proved that sometimes the most devastating response to a challenge is simply to show who you really are. The studio where it all happened still stands, though it's no longer part of the Motown operation. Sometimes late at night, people claim they can still hear something. A piano playing softly, a voice barely above a whisper, singing about Abraham, Martin, and John. About men who tried to say that we could determine our own destiny, that we soon would be free. In that silence, in that space between notes, the real soul lives on.